העולם אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו לעשות דברי Torah.
Amen, amen.
Right. All right, we got a juicy text study today. Feel free, Ari, if you want to open this up in the text area. We're dedicating today's learning to the memory of Dr. King, to all of those who were on the front lines, continuing to fight for equality. And we dedicate also, you can dedicate privately or publicly here in the chat area to someone whom you love who needs healing, or a yard site. Use the chat, or just have that person in mind also at this moment. We have some beautiful texts. I think this is I think this is Torah at its best, you know, and when it speaks and intersects with our lives in this profound way. So we hope that we'll share the text here. We shared it in the two different ways that people have told us they like it, PDF and also the original source sheet. We have a very, very misbehaving mouse here, so just bear with us as we kind of bring it up. Rabbi Kolaresis, can you take us away? I'm going to share the screen, if I can find it.
So we're starting with some texts by Martin Luther King from an essay that he wrote called 3 Ways of Meeting Oppression. And I think they both, the two texts that we're starting with, frame this parsha beautifully, exactly on point. And for me, especially concerning the midwives, but there's lots of resistance and disruption in this parsha. It's the beginning of freedom and liberation. So I will start with asking someone to read the first text. Someone in the room? Should we start with someone in the room?
I'll read it.
Elliot.
Okay.
You know what, just read a little bit slowly and projecting.
Okay. To accept passively an unjust system is to cooperate with that system. Thereby the oppressed become as evil as the oppressor. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. The oppressed must never allow the conscience of the oppressor to slumber. Religion reminds every human being that he or she is his or her brother or sister's keeper. To accept injustice or segregation passively is to say to the oppressor that his actions are morally right. It is a way of allowing his conscience to fall asleep. At this moment, the oppressed fails to be his brother or sister's keeper. So acquiescence, while often the easier way, is not the moral way. It is the way of the coward. The Negro cannot win the respect of his oppressor by acquiescing. He or she merely increases the oppressor's arrogance and contempt. Acquiescence is interpreted as proof of the Negro's inferiority. The Negro cannot win the respect of the white people of the South or the peoples of the world if he is willing to sell the future of his children for his personal and immediate comfort and safety.
So what a powerful passage. And I think it implicates every single one of us, because accepting passively the ways of oppression in a culture is sort of what we're invited to do in our everyday lives in some way or another. So I was personally brought up to obey, and for whatever reason that was constitutionally impossible for me. And it's not that for me early on, it wasn't an act of courage to disobey, it was just who I was. Like, it's what I needed to do in a traditional community in order to survive. And that's something I've been reckoning with and wrestling with my entire life in one way or another. Good morning. Do you want to add some thoughts to this question of what does it mean to accept passively?
But in your community, were you expected to obey because you had come from families who had experienced oppression
No.
in Middle Eastern countries?
No.
Well, I think, like, listen, I was, again, not everything has to relate back to Jews, but then again, we are a Jewish community, and it happens to be Shabbat, and we're not only talking about the Black experience or a woman's experience or a man's, we're talking about the experience of people who on some level, Dr. King is speaking about, when the desire to cooperate in whatever system it is, and at whatever level, and one shuts down one's own true experience or one's integrity or one's authenticity for the sake of either, some benefit on some level. And I think that certainly he was speaking to people who were willing to benefit from a system that was corrupt because at that moment they were benefiting. But I know my father and others, Jews who came to this country, have this experience on a very profound level of giving up their Judaism or assimilating to some extent, and that impulse to not speak up or not to not be themselves because of fear of being of anti-Semitism or feeling being fired or whatever it might be, or not fitting in. And there's this kind of, I think that Rabbi King is speaking in a profound way towards to a very human phenomenon. It wasn't like, he was, singly happy to be speaking to his community, but I think that the general willingness for all kinds of, like he called people cowards. I would say that there's a certain cowardice, but there's also, on a more compassionate level, this is not an easy thing, right? It's not as though, of course that's why he had to say it, right? There is an impetus to cooperate on some level.
Especially when your life is at stake.
And your life is at stake,
right? Your survival's at stake.
Your survival's at stake, absolutely.
And for some people or groups, it's about getting ahead or succeeding in a society. And for other groups, it's just about living and surviving.
Certainly. And by the way, I would also,
level.
like anything else in a Beit Midrash and anything else in our tradition, maybe that's why it's called a Beit Midrash, because the letter Bet is two. Like, there's always a dialectic here. I don't think that there's, I think that it's interesting. Whenever we read, Dr. King, we choose one piece of his oeuvre. But like, for example, Malcolm X was extremely critical of Dr. King's approach, and others who felt that Dr. King himself was on some level, right, not radical enough in terms of his, willingness to play by the rules of the society and so on. So I think that, when he says, at this moment, the oppressed fails to be his brother's keeper, right? Acquiescence, often the easier way is not the moral way. It's the way of the coward. So I think like that, the question of what it means to be non-cooperative with evil is itself the larger unknown here. And what does that mean exactly?
Well, we're going to get to the midwives soon, but I think the midwives are a beautiful example of what you do in everyday life and what you're asked to do, and suddenly saying, no, I'm not going to do that.
Totally.
Shoshana, you wanted to say something?
I read this and I felt it was a commentary on Vayikra 19:17, right? Like it felt to me so Vayikra, like Lo tisa achicha bilvavecha, don't hate your brother in your heart, rather hocheach tochiach et amitecha, like rebuke your fellow, velo tisa alav chet, which can be interpreted as don't let him carry around his sin. So there's so much. I read this today, like there's so much kindness. I read this as chesed, as kindness to racists. Don't be unkind to them by letting them sleep. Of course, it's waking us up. He's reminding us we need to stop sleeping and being comfortable and making those other choices for survival and getting ahead and all that. But I read it in the light of loving your fellow through rebuke, which
that is really
Rabbi
powerful.
said they're very bad at.
And it's also al tasim l'shol lifnei there. Like don't put an obstacle in front of a blind person, because if they're blind to the oppression they're wreaking on someone else, then point it out.
And in general, everything from the holiness code, from that area of the Torah, is things that we normally do in private that only God sees and only our conscience knows or doesn't know. So I just felt it was like, I know you're doing Parshat Shemot, but it just felt like popping out. That was just what happened for me.
It's amazing, it's kind of funny, when I read this too, I read it, and I said this to Rabbi Kolesis yesterday, I actually read it, believe it or not, in the vein of you know, given everything that's going on in the state of Israel right now, I read it actually in the writings of Meir Kahane. If you read anyone who is speaking to a people who are assimilating, right here again, he's speaking to people that have been oppressed and so on. But like, you know, when Meir Kahane came along, and one of his messages, of course, he was himself a racist and in many ways had fascistic tendencies, and we see where that landed. But if you read, and Shaul Magid wrote a lot about, he did a lot of research on Meir Kahane. Like when Meir Kahane comes along and starts talking to suburban Jews who are making their way up the ladder of success in America, and who are throwing away their kind of their Jewish tribalism to a certain extent, Kahane's critique was rooted, and I've watched a lot of his stuff. You know, I became fascinated with when Shaul also became fascinated. I started watching him in YouTube videos. His critique is very similar in a certain way. Like, you guys are all benefiting from being able to assimilate here in America, but you're forgetting about your ethnic roots. You're forgetting about, you become a acculturated Jew, and like, you know, here you are in you know, and the doors are opening to you, and he was railing against it. He was saying, like, you know, what happened to your Judaism? What happened to your ethnic pride? You know, instead of a lot of other things.
But his conclusion wasn't nonviolent.
Of course, the
Right,
conclusion was
that's the
violent.
big difference,
Usually
right.
is. But again, if you read again, Malcolm X and others who were a bit more extreme than Dr. King were actually suggesting disrupting and not, you know, and not playing. They saw his passivity and his satyagraha, all of this approach, as being extremely ineffective. And right, so Dr. King, thank God, was rooted in nonviolence and in disruption, but peacefully, and waking up the other, as you said beautifully, like seeing the other as right. But like, there's a certain sense here of him saying, giving tochacha, saying, you know, what about your brothers? What about, like, stop, you know, acquiescing on some level, and own, right, who you are and what the story is here, and don't leave others behind for the sake of your own comfort on some level. Yeah. Elliot.
So it's interesting, since you brought up Meir Kahane and what's going on in Israel right now, and given what we're looking at right here, I think we have to ask ourselves, okay, what does it mean for us to be silent, okay, in the face of what's going on in Israel right now? And what courage would it take?
Right, and so there are, as you see, like today, talk to Nadav Lev is coming, he's in from Israel. Nadav, our amazing guitar player, is in from Israel. And if you speak, I had lunch with him this week, and you know, and you read some of the things, there are huge protests that are going on right now.
Right.
And there are huge, you know, people are marching in the streets and protesting peacefully.
Right.
And speaking, for sure. And so, yeah, we absolutely, there's a voice here for that too. There's a voice here for that. But we'll see, we'll wait to see what happens, right, in as we go forward, but certainly at this moment. There are people protesting the members of the new government who have shown, you know, that they have said, made racist statements, and they have suggested racist and anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab policies and so on. So there's a lot to talk about. But we could go far afield here. We'll come back to that. Let's go back to the text. We can come back to that, just to come back to
Yeah,
that.
no, it's relevant.
You want
Yeah.
to skip the next one and go to Hebrews? Okay.
All you.
Okay. Okay, so we have source number 3 is all about Pharaoh's fear and anxiety, and it's so interesting that oppression starts in fear, right? Oppression starts in fear of the other, and a kind of miscasting of the other, like a non-accurate understanding of who the other is. So we'll read that text and then go to the midwives and start really focusing on resistance and what resistance looks like. Okay, Vayakam melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada Yosef. So a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So not only does it begin in anxiety, maybe anxiety leads to this not knowing. Vayomer el amo, hinei am b'nei Yisrael rav va'atzum mimenu. And he said to his people, or he said to his nation, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. And this is the first place that the Hebrews are called a nation, called an Am. Hava nitchak malo, pen yirbeh, v'haya itikrena b'chama, v'nosaf gam hu al son'enu, v'nilcham banu v'ala min haaretz. So let us deal shrewdly with them. Let's outsmart them so that they may not increase. So Pharaoh's pretty obsessed with this, with the birth rate. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. Now, rise, ba'alam and it's a very mysterious phrase, right? It's like, and they'll leave and they'll rise up and they'll gain in power. It's not really clear what's going on there.
It's also powerful that Nosaf and Yosef here. Like there's a whole,
Nice.
There's like they don't trust them in that way, and maybe Joseph was never fully trusted either, or maybe the text is saying the opposite because of that he's forgotten Joseph, instead of seeing that they could be a source of great
An ally.
a Hosafah in a good way, right?
hunger,
Exactly. Like
Right.
they're miscasting, right, the Yosef element here,
Well,
like
they're
seeing the
miscast-
immigrants as a problem instead of as a boon. So-
Right, although remember Yosef is also the one who disempowered the whole population.
Right. Also.
Right, he's a complicated legacy. Vayasimu alav sarei misim lema'an anoto b'sivlotam. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them, to exploit them, to abuse them with forced labor. Then arei miskanot leParo et Pitom ve'et Ramses, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pitom and Ramses. V'cha asher ya'anu oto ken yirbeh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, increased, and spread out. V'chen yifrotz. V'yakutsu mipnei b'nei Yisrael, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. So I was really interested in this word. I was looking at this yesterday. V'yakutsu, like kotzim, thorns. And the last time it was used was when Rebecca said that the wives Ishmael was taking, Esau was taking, were thorn to her, were like, made her life miserable.
Never understood this verse, by the way. Never understood, like, as they suffered, they increased.
As they were abused.
Like they abused them more, can you bet?
Yeah.
Like there is clearly.
Well, I think
the opposite,
Pharaoh's
like-
attempts at oppression backfire again and again, starting here.
Right, but like,
Right?
yeah,
No, it doesn't.
Why?
Right.
that begs the question,
Doesn't
but also
backfire.
maybe it's a feature of the feature of the Israelites is that as they suffer,
They were stiff-necked.
they were stiff-necked, or
As
they were
the
even more.
Gentiles call us.
Well, I think the person who tries to control, or the forces that are often foiled, right? Like that attempt to control in the world leads to chaos.
Yeah, but why would they multiply it?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Maybe
Why
the
specifically?
multiplication.
Sorry to interrupt. We're just getting some requests to move the text
Oh,
when
yeah.
you're able
Sorry,
to.
thanks for interrupting.
Thank you, Ari. We
Ari,
appreciate
way to
it.
go. Way to disrupt.
Way to disrupt and interrupt. I love it. Why multiply it? It's interesting because Genesis is the book of barrenness, and
And here we went.
Exodus is the book of barrenness. Genesis is the book of, they can't have babies, right? Again and again, every generation, they can't
Right.
get pregnant, and here we're in the book of multiplication. So it's the very opposite. And the challenge here is not establishing the Israelite family. That happened already. The challenge here is to establish a spiritual nation.
It could be also that the numerousness
Yeah,
is perceived rather than actual.
well, that's true, because Pharaoh's worst nightmare here starts with that fear.
Right.
They're gonna multiply,
Right.
right? So that's what's happening. It's
Right.
like your worst fear comes true,
Right.
because somehow you invite that in the world by avoiding it somehow.
Yes.
Yeah,
But what it also does though is unfortunately gives, like, there's no room for compassion for Pharaoh, but it underscores, it makes sense that he increases his desperate attempts to control the population. In other words, like, it's a really good bridge between
I
making them
have compassion for
suffer.
Pharaoh.
I don't
There's
know.
no room, I have
A little
compassion.
bit of room, not that much.
He's like an insecure guy with a lot of
Yeah,
power.
yeah, compassion.
But his
There's a very politically savvy and timely midrash in Midrash Rabbah that argues that he didn't have this fear at all. This was public opinion, and he went with it. And he went with it the usual way. These are like the 4 steps to enslaving a vulnerable group.
Yeah.
And the purpose is not to make them smaller. The purpose is to get people disgusted, so you can do anything to them. You can be as violent as you can to people you've dehumanized.
Right.
But it's a beautiful thing. Like, the rabbis are completely aware of the cynical ways that politicians will just have to go with their party or with their base. And it's right there in Midrash Rabbah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And because it's unclear whether he is the same king, because it doesn't tell us that the old king died. And therefore he, benefited from Joseph and doesn't have a negative view of Joseph, but he had to forget him.
So
In the
he's
face of
playing to a
public-
disempowered base.
He's playing to a base that maybe had, the Midrash doesn't argue it, but I agree with you that there's blowback from the Joseph time. There has to be blowback.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Because Joseph was
yeah.
incredibly fascistic himself. He put the whole country under martial law. There should
Joseph
be
did?
there should be blowback to Joseph.
Ooh.
How he
But
performed.
I don't want it to be like this, but what can you do? He
I'm very wary of those midrashim because I don't want to give them, like, I'm also wary of, like, it's very close to blaming the Jews for their own slavery. It's very close.
But it's back to our first text. Joseph, to survive, participates like a great court Jew in the oppression of a regime. And it's not that we're
His
being
clothes
punished.
are all on the bed. You might just need to help him because he needs to wind it's a fake book.
Somebody just didn't have
Someone
it.
forgot to mute.
Is it in a midrash where it says he exerted martial law?
No.
Or-
No, that's in the
No.
Torah.
That's right in
Well,
the Torah?
It doesn't,
It's
it's
a way to
martial law,
read
he's
it.
using martial law, it's not martial law, but he actually, all of the land of Egypt becomes owned by Pharaoh, right? So
He
essentially,
moves populations, he indentures the whole
Prophylactic.
population, in
Indentures.
exchange,
There are certain words.
in exchange for food.
Because of the famine.
They're starving, or
Right.
they don't have access to food, and he gives it to them in exchange for their work, their labor,
But-
I can show you the passage later.
Historically, court Jews were partners with central powers, and our 1%ers or our point, like, what's less than 1%?
I'm sorry, I see Joseph as a good guy. I'm
He's a
gonna
complicated
stop.
guy, but let's not
Good and
debate that now. Let's go on, we're gonna go on.
Yeah.
This is,
yeah.
okay, I have a very quickly.
Yeah, quickly, I really want to say, I think you're spot on. I think this intersects between like the present interplay between racism, anti-Semitism, and the conflation too of a lot of these things, Israel, Palestine. I think it lives in this fear that the Jews are the court Jew, that they do influence, and that all of our struggles against oppression are like, they fade away, and no one is aware of where we stand on any of these other things, because they're so fixed on this
But they forget their
this dimension,
participation.
that they forget that they're actually
participated in our
polluted in some way by
persecution.
not resisting.
So that we were limited in our roles.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I just want to name that I fundamentally find that position, not only do I find it pernicious and potentially widespread, but I also find it problematic and I decry it. I decry.
What-
Yeah,
what
I'm
position?
agreeing.
What
I'm
No,
saying
I
we are-
decry, I also don't agree that is an overt, it's not an overtly held, I think that there are multiple variables in anti-Semitism and its intersection with racism, and I don't think that there's only one, that the fear that the Jews are the core Jew is one piece of a
Yes, I agree.
very complicated jungle of motivations.
I totally agree. I
It's
just
just
think
one
she
of
pointed
many
to one.
potential
Yeah.
things, one of
I
many,
would
many.
agree.
Okay, anyway, so we should go on. So verse, where you actually wouldn't finish, verse 13, by Avidim Mitzrayim B'nei Shel B'Farach, they made them, right, they ruthlessly imposed them hard labor, made their lives bitter. This is where the maror comes from, verse 14, right? Avodah kasha, chomer levainim, with, right, and all of the different work in the field, right? So the Israelites are being oppressed. Now, amidst this oppression, this scene, the very next scene is Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim. We're in source 4, and this is where the first moment of resistance is.
Okay.
That's okay. Vayomer Melech Mitzrayim L'Midaldot Ha'Ivriyot Asher Shem Achat Shifra V'Shem Hashenit Pu'ah. It's not moving. Please move. Yes.
There we go.
Vayomer, he said to them, to these two.
Oh, before we get there, so the Hebrew midwives, so the question is, and it's not clear from the text, are they midwives to the Hebrews or are they Hebrew themselves?
Right.
So they may be Egyptian, they may be, and reading the narrative one direction or another is very different.
Either way, though, what
Either
they
way,
do.
they're resistors.
Yeah, either
for
way,
sure.
what they do is remarculous and requires incredible courage.
Yeah.
And the conversation between them and Pharaoh that will ensue right now is also shocking, and like to imagine this conversation happening, especially if they are Hebrew slaves, would be amazing. But Yomer, he says to them, this is his instruction to them. He says, when you give, right there, when you help birth these Ivriot, these women who are Hebrew, right? Hebrew women. Or itenet al ovnaim, and you will see on the ovnaim, there's a birth stool. The word Evan here means like a stone, but it's a birth stone. Im ben hu v'amitenoto, if a male baby is born, kill him. Im bati v'chaya, and if it is a daughter, then allow that daughter to live. Batir enna. Now, the word here beautifully bolded by Rabbi Koresis is
Beautifully bold.
I think it's important. No, I think it's really bolded because I think it's when you see them and then there's a fear. The play here is between optical what is seen and what is feared, because the word, of course, is grammatically, they're etymologically connected and they're played off each other here. In other words, there's something about the vision of these women that is also connected with their own sense of reverence for life and their own sense of awe.
Right, awe, right.
Their
It's
awe.
very important to put that word awe in there,
And
not
because
just fear.
right, and we'll come back in this moment in the next midrash, because for them, the divinity of birth and the divinity of the one whom they fear, meaning the one whom they really worship, is paramount. And they are not afraid, though, of Pharaoh. And that's the point, that they have a fear of God rooted in their reverence for life. And that actually acts as a counter to what they should be afraid of, which is power. They're not afraid of power. They're in reverence of life.
They might be somewhat afraid, we'll see in a minute.
We'll see in a minute.
But they're more afraid, or they're more in reverence of life.
It doesn't say that they're afraid. Anyway, so but maybe they act in a fearful way by lying, but maybe
Exactly.
not. Right, we'll see. So it says in verse 17, they are afraid of, they had fear of God, or they had awe of God. And they just didn't listen to what was told to them. That's an amazing thing. And they let the children live. But they alived them. They enlivened them. And the king of Egypt called to them, which is amazing too. He said to them, why did you do this? In other words, you should have just killed them, but he wants to engage them in a conversation, which is also amazing. The author of this text wants us to hear the Egyptian king plead with them. Like why? Like what? But why did you enliven these children? Or accuse them, or interrogate them? But and they said to him, the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're animals, or they're alive. They're vital. There's something here that is distinguishing these two. They're doing it all by themselves. They don't need, right? They give birth without a midwife.
So I think they're using his fear of the Israelites, saying they're like animals, to kind of almost assuage him from attacking them.
Yeah, they trap him.
They trap him.
They trap him in his own devices. They're very clever.
How do they trap him?
He can't publicly, if this conversation is in front of his court, he cannot criticize them publicly.
Because it's not their fault.
No, because he sounded just like them. They look like great anti-Semites in this moment.
Right, exactly. They're
by
playing
exaggerating.
I see.
Right.
But he exaggerated
Nice.
the liveliness of the Israelites.
Nice.
So are they.
They're animals.
right? Which is why I think Abarbanel says
Yeah,
later
yeah.
on, he puts them under house arrest.
Right.
And that's what somebody giving them batim means. He gets them back later, for some of the scholars who look at the conclusion that
Now, I don't understand verse 20, like, Yitev Elohim lam yaldot, vayarev ha'am vayatzimu ma'od, like, God does, well with them, and the nation increases. That feels like they are Hebrew slaves, because otherwise, why would it be good for them that the Israelites proliferate at this
No,
point?
their work is successful.
No, I think,
The baby boys didn't die, and they keep increasing,
Okay,
right?
nice.
It's like, they're effective, they and their
In
cohorts,
fact.
their
Right.
community
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
midwives
Yeah,
have become
they have
they're
success.
on the side of
They get rich.
God,
Awesome.
and they keep
Awesome.
multiplying.
Awesome. And verse 21,
They support the birth rate, right?
Right, Vayiki yaru am yaldot Elohim, and it was the proclamation of verse 21, right, that God saw that because they had fear, as it were, they saw God, or they had fear of God, Vayaslahem batim, and God makes them houses,
he
right?
made them.
Right,
He made them houses.
right,
It's a pronoun.
Vayas, he made for them houses.
Who's the he?
Right,
That's ambiguous.
but, okay, it's ambiguous, but God, Ha Elohim, the God, and, right, we'll get to this in a second. More. Now Pharaoh says it didn't work to be discreet.
Foiled again.
Foiled again, exactly. It didn't work to be discreet, and now he commands them. Not just speaks to them by Yitzhak, and he gives them a command. It's like a proclamation across the nation, to the whole nation. Kol habena yilode, or if everybody here is deputized to do the work of killing Jewish babies and keeping daughters alive.
everyone, right?
Right. Now, this is a remarkable scene, which concludes the first chapter of the book of Exodus, leads into this even more remarkable, incredible midrash, which is a modern midrash by Orna Pelletz, about what just took place.
Right, and I think it's driven by the question of how did their awe lead to their resistance? Like, what's the connection here? And it's a profound question, because how did they know God? Like, what's going on here? So this midrash comes to answer that. Okay, so the first two, number 2 and number 3, are the verses we just read, so I'm not going to read that. The midwives were asked, where did you get your fearful awe of God? Nishalu this is a contemporary Israeli midrash, I have to say that. Nishalu hamiyaldot, minayin yirat Elohim shahita lachem. So where did you get your fearful awe of God? And they answered, from the great and deep things that we saw at the birth stool, from the mystery that embraces us morning and evening, human being after human being coming into the world. Where does he come from? And what does he bring with him? The goodness that her mother sees in her, the compassion and the love that she awakens, crying babies and bursting forth from exhausted bodies, and a soft seal of God's finger imprinted on their faces. The Heshiva, Mimarot Dolim va'amukim shara'inu al ha'avnayim, Mehamistoromin she'afafunu boker ve'erev, Adam va'od Adam ba'al olam, Me'ayin hu ba, B'ma mevihu uto, Hatov she'imo ro'ebo, and something's cut out there, Tinokot pu'im migichim migufot do'adim, Va'chotemet haracha shel etzba Elohim, Tfu'ah b'fneihem.
Ukshu lahem. V'harei b'har Sinai nemar, and the midwives were challenged, but didn't it happen at Sinai? Meaning, v'chol ha'am ro'im et ha'kolot v'et ha'lapidim et kol ha'shofar v'da'ar Hashem v'yar ha'am v'yanu v'ya'amdu mirachok. Like didn't fear, like this whole section 5 didn't fear really only happen to some degree at Har Sinai, meaning at the revelation at Sinai, when God revealed God's own self, right? And the entire nation saw God, and they stood at a distance, right? And God, and Yirat Elohim makom shel kolot uvrakim ba. It's like this modern midrash says, doesn't the fear, the word Yirah here is literally connected to Har Sinai by the word itself, right? They saw Yirah, they saw God, and there was fear and awe. Doesn't this kind of fearful awe of God come from the place where thunder and lightning appear? Ve'eshivu. And then the midwives answer, there is fearful awe that comes from external seeing, right? Yesh yirah ba'mitoch ri'ah shel chutz. A person can be frozen in terror witnessing a supernatural miracle which awakens and strengthens her sense of fearful awe. But for us, it doesn't work like that, right? right? Etzlenu eina davar kach. Yiratenu, our fearful awe, lo b'shamayim, is not in the heavens. It's not from the heavens. It's not the fear of heaven. Our fearful awe of God arises precisely from within nature itself, from within the pain of what we witness on the birth stool. From there we choose what is good, to protect life, to fight against death, and to resist evil. Right? Mitoch Ev, Hamarot ala Ovnaim, Noda banu Yirat Elohim, Vilimdanu Livchor, Ulamdenu Livchor Betov, Lishmor al Chaim, Lehilachem b'mavet, Ulehitnaged b'ra. Amazing.
It's an amazing midrash. So where do we learn to resist evil? Where do we learn that from? So for them, it's through witnessing birth again and again. Right? And for us, is it from Torah? Is it from some other source? Is it from witnessing, human beings suffer day in and day out? What is it? Is it both?
What about witnessing the sunrise and the sunset?
Absolutely, wanting to protect our earth, for sure. For sure, Tony, that's beautiful.
I mean, there's a lot of answers to your question.
What's really challenging about this midrash, besides, a lot of us, I think when we read it, it kind of resonates almost immediately. But what's challenging about it, of course, is that it's almost anti-revelation in its or the supernatural and religion itself.
Yeah.
Is it anti-revelation or addition? It's an addition to revelation.
Well, it implicates it to some degree. I mean, in this last piece, this conversation between Sinai and the birth stool is in many ways it's a conversation between immanence and transcendence, between like
they didn't need Torah. It is
the
challenging.
bar mitzvah boy has a comment.
Before I just want to say before we go there, I also feel like there are. I saw Paul Solomon had his hand up, and I wanted to. Is it okay just to take Paul and then we'll come back into the room? We haven't actually engaged the Zoom people. Zoomers, go ahead, Paul, go ahead, and then we'll come back in the room.
Maybe stop.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to go back to the pharaohs seeing the Hebrew people as animals, and the language of the midwives that suggests they were also animal-like. And that playbook was very effective for slave owners, for racists, for into the Jim Crow era, and even to today, to see Black people as animals and justified all the extraordinary abuse and persecution. And I think that even extends to people's, racist, people who look at non-binary people and trans people, the whole LGBT spectrum, and say that, these aren't really humans the way we think of it, and they're really sexual freaks. And I think it all has a lot in common here.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that dehumanization is common across many lines. Okay, you just want to stay in Zoom?
Well, I said we were going to come back, so Paul, go ahead, and then we'll go back. We'll take two more comments.
Can I just ask, when was this midrash written?
It's like really
contemporary. Very.
Yeah.
It's now.
Yeah.
It's now. Okay.
Paul, did you want to say something, or?
Just that it seems, so the question is, what is driving the midwives? What is motivating the midwives? And the answer to that question is faith.
Yeah.
Faith. They don't know. The odds are against them. In fact, Pharaoh ups the ante. He makes it even worse, which is typical. It's almost axiomatic in revolutions that the oppressed are worse off immediately and generally never make it out of their oppression. So the only way that anyone sensibly or insensibly can rise up, initially at least, is based on this crazy faith.
It's like out of Lord of the Rings.
Lord
of the Rings. It's like out of Lord of the Rings.
But faith in what?
Well, for the midwives, it's clear. It's Yud Hey Vav Hey. Clear.
It could be faith in doing the right thing.
But in this case, it's faith in God.
Okay.
Well, in the midrash, it's and there's a lot here. And by the way, believe it or not, we also wanted. I think it's important to do the next piece. But I want to do the next piece. I know we've talked about this so much, but it's very clear from the midrash, from this midrash, that these women are imbued with a sense of the sacred from their calling and from the birth experience itself, and it's clear from the Midrash, at least the Midrashic author here is trying to say that, you know, I would say that a natural moral sensibility or intuition is being invited here. That, like, where do they get their sense of what's right? They get it from the sense that life itself is sacred, and that they're witnessing Mount Sinai in every birth, and that every birth, right, every single birth is a moment of revelation about the power of life itself.
Amen.
And that they're not, like, that's what she's saying is Yirat Elohim. Like, it's not some religious, because the text of the Torah has not yet been given. That's what's complicated about this Midrash, is like, if these women have fear of God and it's rooted in revelation at Sinai, Sinai has not yet taken place.
Well, it's like Abraham. It's
Right, like Avram, there's a certain something here that's certainly, like, right, like the way that the Midrash imagines Avram knows Torah from his body.
Yeah.
They know Torah from their body, from and they're women.
Amen.
Right, it's almost like this, the miracle of
Embody
revelation.
what they witness day in and day out.
Right, they give birth to life, right, and Pharaoh wants to take life away.
I almost wish that she hadn't thrown in the revelation at Sinai in order to maybe root it in most Jewish readings of what revelation is, but there, you know, which is greater, the revelation at the splitting of the sea or Sinai? The rabbis asked that. And the splitting of the sea is a kind of national birth, right? The Torah and spiritual experience of Jews with uteruses was not written down, generally. So it's like a miracle that this got written down.
Jews with uteruses.
Yes. It wasn't written down.
Jews with uteruses.
It might have been put into tapestries, into Torah dressings by Yemenite women, but it's a problem to say that this version of revelation of the Mialdot, who feared God or the gods, we don't know how to read it, from life itself, is somehow not part of our tradition. I think that's problematic I find that really hard.
It is part of our tradition.
I know, but to say one's over here and one's over here instead of they're both, these are both equal ways Jews have oriented towards God and towards resistance. And one hasn't been written enough about.
Yes,
in terms of words or read.
So that's why we're talking about.
There are two streams.
Yeah.
We're talking about.
So you think the Midrash is saying they're not equal?
No, it's something that Rabbi David said about like maybe I misunderstood. The revelation at Sinai is like in contradistinction to this, to what she's saying.
Until we unearth all of the possible ways that there is a counterculture, it's pretty clear that for 2,000 years there was a dominant, and for whatever reason, and we haven't yet
in our
unearthed.
texts, but not in our experience as a people.
Right, but like, again, so I think that even if this were not about women, if it were, whenever there have been texts about nature versus revelation, there's always been a dominant conversation about that tension and the dangers of that are inherent in that polemic, in that dialectic. So whether it's
in a certain
whether it's
club,
Spinoza,
in a certain club,
well,
they see the dangers, but in the other community, it's not a problem.
Or the danger is the opposite.
What's the danger?
What do you mean? In Spinoza,
like God comes to us through our bodies, and God comes to us through transcendence.
And there's a lot of problems theologically and philosophically between natural religion, religion and revelation that is derived from nature versus supernatural. I mean, I'm not the first person. It's not unique to a gender or a particular biology. Okay. It's unique to whether or not it's immanence versus transcendence, and that's a common trope across the board, whether it's in Zen or it's in Hinduism or it's across the board. So like, I think there's a tension there, and I think that this author is underscoring that tension in a profoundly beautiful way, because there are nafkamino, there are actually practical implications between whether or not you source morality in the lived experience of your body and of your lived reality versus an extra moral voice. And I think that that's a legitimate conversation. Like to admit that those two things are in perfect harmony, and the only difference is that one was voiced and the other was silence. It just doesn't do justice to the complexity of that.
Okay, I have felt very personally harmed by the other side that's always pushing transcendence.
Oh, me too.
Just like, I'm trying to rebuild myself
Oh,
from
me too.
those voices.
And thank God, we thank God, all of us in Romemu and other neo-Hasidic communities place a strong emphasis on immanence and on the body and on your moral intuition that isn't found in a text. And I think we're all, thank God for this.
Okay, then you were just stating the conversation.
Yes, I was just
Okay,
stating.
instead of advocating.
I wasn't
Okay.
advocating for one over the other.
This is
God
the
forbid.
miracle
God
to
forbid.
find here.
Yeah.
Body's our middle name.
So
I
should,
think we have to go on.
yeah, can we just go, if we could go to source 6. This is, I talked about this last night in my sermon, this amazing verse in the beginning of chapter 2, which is Vayelech ish mibeit Levi vayikach et bat Levi. And this certain unnamed, unknown slave, who happens to be from the house of Levi, took a daughter of Levi. And this disruption, of course, why is it a disruption? Because the verse that immediately precedes it is telling us how radical it is to go have a baby. It's like how dangerous it is to go have a baby. The verse that immediately precedes this, or the scene, was that having a child was horrifically scary. If you had a daughter, you were fine, but if you had a son, it was horrible. But then if you turn to the next source, I'm sorry, I forgot to share the screen, sorry about that. And if you look at source, the continuation of source 7, you see that, of course, their greatest fears, are realized. Like Vatar, she becomes pregnant, and she has a son. Now, the first thing we know, though, I just want to say, the first thing we know about this child is amazing because the ocularity, the vision comes back immediately, right? The ones who saw in the previous scene and whose sight and whose fear were intimately connected, they saw life in this child, not a potential danger, but life itself. The first thing that happens is that the Isha, this unnamed woman, sees this child, and like God in the book of Genesis, which the rabbis connect, right? Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov, and God saw that it was good. She sees ki tofu, that he was good, right? And so she hides him for 3 moons. So
already it's a profound act of resistance, also related to seeing, just like the Miguel dealt.
Exactly. And so we know the scene. She takes the child and she tries to hide him for 3 moons, and then she couldn't hide him any longer because apparently the jig was up and it became difficult, impossible. And so she takes a wicker basket, caulks it with bitumen and pitch, with zafed and chemar, and she puts the child in, and she puts them on the reeds and onto the lip of the Nile, by the bank of the Nile. And then this remarkable verse that we're going to come back to in the open up this morning at the end of the Torah service today, Vatetatsav achoto mirachok, verse 4, and his sister stands at a distance, and to see what would happen to this child.
Or to know.
To know, right? I'm sorry, to know. To know what would happen to him.
Right.
And then, Batered bat paro lechot al yaor v'narotel lechot al yaor al yad yaor, and now the daughter of Pharaoh, also unnamed, goes down to wash in the Nile, and her maidservants or the girls, the Na'arot, are walking with her, and she sees again. She sees again. Batered tativan, she sees this ark, this little basket in the Nile. And she sends out her maidservant to get it, right? Which is all amazing, by the way. Like, it's just, the whole thing is just blows your mind. Like, why would they put him into the Nile? But apparently, like Rabbi Clarkson was saying, the simple meaning is they did what they were told. It was kind of like, this is his, he's gonna die. Even if they put him into a basket, he's gonna die. They didn't throw him into the Nile, but they kind of gave in to they couldn't do it, there was no way. So they at least put him in, they set him up for potentially something to take place. And the daughter of Pharaoh, the daughter of the most hated, the Hitler of the story, the daughter there is now becomes the hero. She opens up and she sees the child. And again, she sees the child. Once again, just like the mother saw, she sees. And behold, there was a nar, a little lad that was crying. Maybe here he's called a nar because her na'arotea are also humans to her, even though they're servants, but maybe she sees him as a human on some level, and he's crying, and she has compassion for him, which is also amazing. It's like that she had compassion for the child, like his crying was just touched her. Vatomer miyaldei Evriyim that, of course, so she said it must be. She said out loud. Of course, she knew that it was the Hebrew child, because what other children would be thrown into the Nile? It must be, Vatomer achoto el baparo. And this is the most amazing moment. We were talking about this. That this moment where everything is open and the sister has the unbelievable courage, audacity, power to slip in here at this profound moment of possibility and inserts and speaks to this daughter of Pharaoh. She says, "Hey, ha'elech v'karati lach isha mineked min ha'ivriot." I have an idea. Why don't I go why don't I save this child for you? Right? Because before, Pharaoh's daughter can just make a decision in the other direction. She says, "Hey, I can go get you the mother to be a milk nurse." This is like the whole Torah is about go, lechi, go. Vatelech.
So it's the Lech Lecha from Abraham.
It's the Lech Lecha from Abraham. It's Rebecca. It's all of the go do this mission. But the Krat Em Ayaleh, she calls the mother of the child, even though it doesn't say she calls her mother, right? The mother of the child, not her mother, the mother of the child. But Tomer la bat Paro, and then bat Paro said to her, says, so then the daughter of Pharaoh is now speaking to the mother of the child, take this child and nurse him, and so on. And we get to I'll pay you. And she takes the child and she nurses him. And then verse 10, and then when the child was old enough, she brought him to Bat Paro, and she became her son. The son who will redeem the Jewish people comes from within the palace, like raised, adopted by, loved into humanity by the daughter of the enemy. Vatikra Shmo Moshe, and now his name, she gives him a name, right? The first name in chapter 2 is given by the daughter of the enemy to Moshe, and she calls him Moshe Kimin Amayim Mishiti, because I have brought him forth from Mishitiu, like I drew him from the water, and Moshe becomes the savior.
One of the extraordinary things here is that Miriam reconnects the mother and the child, and Miriam's like the great reconnector in other texts as well. And she gets her mother, who's like a Hebrew slave, paid to breastfeed her own child. Like it's a redemption we haven't yet reached.
Like a business, like it's smart.
No, value. It's value.
Right? Value. She has actually paid.
That, women need to get paid for breastfeeding their children.
Right.
There's something about valuing that.
So, being valued, yeah.
It's
she
really
winds
radical.
Up paying her, right? Amazing
it's just
moment.
An extraordinary detail.
So the reason why we wanted to bring this story, it was also because in the context of this story, there's also a prophecy of Miriam and what motivated her on some level. I mean, we could, on the simplest level, these texts almost don't need midrashim. They're just so powerful.
They're all about resistance.
All about resistance on their own. Right. Amazing.
Embedded in life resistance.
Embedded, right there. So maybe like the story speaks for itself, and you don't need the rabbinic glosses on it, but the rabbinic gloss here is also profoundly instructive, because she had a prophecy. Miriam had an amazing prophecy that in source number 8, which underscores. Maybe we'll talk about this prophecy. If you want, we can talk about this prophecy during the open up.
Okay, great.
Because we're going to come back to this moment where basically the strength that Miriam had was not only rooted in her own moral calling, but also in an adherence and an absolute radical commitment to a prophecy that she had received. And so kind of double, like she had a clear vision that also girded her in this moment. Okay, so maybe we can stop. We have a lot of voices. It's a little bit late, so let's, go ahead, Batya.
Okay. So for me, I know how this ends, and so do we all know how this ends. So for me, it's a vision of before the ending of any of my issues, I have to remember all the things that can happen, And what keeps me on the path is my fierce belief in Hashem, that somehow something will happen to make things go in, if I have the right vision, to go forth.
Nice, beautiful, thank you. That's your prophecy.
Do we know how it
Yes.
ends, really?
Yes, go ahead.
Still going on.
I have a way of reading this, which is kind of, I felt also in reading the story of finding the caves of Machpelah, that there's a tone of voice that we don't see in the written thing, where I feel like the characters are all kind of reading from a script, and they all know what's going on, what the whole picture is, and they say these words like, oh, this must be a Hebrew child, like, of course. And Miriam just happening to be there, and knowing that Miriam's there for a reason, and that it's like they all knew what was going on, but they say these words to kind of act out the play. And it wasn't an innocence. You could read this with a kind of innocent sort of
Interesting.
back and forth, and I have a feeling like everyone knew and they all colluded together.
Collusion across enemy lines.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The women.
Women colluding, yeah.